Hello, my name is Muzart. In this video I'm going to communicate with you the type of work I've been doing over several years with regards to small and large scale projects in multiple domains. So I would like to take you with me on a journey of ideas and their practical implications. So I want to talk you through some of the scientific related content I've been investigating almost on a daily basis now, and that I'm very passionate about, and I hope I can share that passion with you as well. Also, I have many technical skills that I've developed over the years that are highly transferable to others, to you, or to anyone else watching this. And finally, I just want to outline how there are some issues or topics like neuroscience, for example, that would be directly relevant to you in many ways, or that would be directly relevant to anyone, and that would be both in terms of people's professional work and their personal lives as well. Right, so I'm also going to put more information in the video description below or somewhere on this page, because I can't cover everything right now, and as usual I usually forget things, so I'm also going to provide links to like media forums for mutual exchange of information with you. That's just to kind of lay the foundation for kind of to have a continuous, ongoing, bi-directional dialogue. So just to start off, I essentially, in a nutshell, I've investigated organisms and systems at all structural levels, from the chemical level, looking at genomics and epigenetics and proteomics, to looking at ensembles or networks of cells, to organ system endophenotypes, to delving deeper into the hierarchies of the connectomes and kind of organism level functions, and all the way to groups of organisms and populations. That would mean looking at the structure, the microanatomy, or the kind of infrastructure of a system, and how it gives rise to specialized emergent functions or functionalities. And of course each of these perspectives are kind of wholly integrated together. They are fully recurrent with one another also in many ways. So there are three main areas to cover here. I think the first is looking at human biology and any physical system that have properties of life. That's the first thing. Secondly, there are also, what I'm interested in is psychological phenomena, or any sort of information processing that results in conscious experience or expression. This of course overlaps with concepts in educational psychology in humans, at all age demographics and at all lifespan developmental stages. And thirdly, there is the idea of technology that I'm very immersed in. So these are essentially concepts implemented as synthetically made tools to make our lives better. So technology would be anything from a pen to an advanced computer, and of course here I'm going to focus on the kind of state of the art of today and modern computers in particular. So a lot of these endeavors are predicated on different cognitive informational processes in the brain. There are learning processes like reading and studying. Also research processes in terms of, for example, what I've done carrying out experimental, scientific or academic research, and there's also, of course, teaching and dissemination of that research and data. Finally, there's also further meta-research on the effectiveness of that dissemination, and of course this feeds back into all the other processes. Just to explain a bit more about each of those. The idea of research, essentially, it involves on the data collection initially, and everything that comes before that, or the planning and so on, and the methods. And so that could be, with data collection, it could be any kind of data. So for example, like biophysiological data, whether it be invasive or non-invasive, biometric information, neuroimaging, psychometrics, cognitive, behavioral, user behavior data. It could be doing measurements both in person and also live in vivo in humans. That could be in labs or observations in naturalistic environments. So often there are hybrid systems in place, such as using electronic portable devices, e-tablets, electronic devices, mobile devices. In fact, let me show you this. So essentially, for any kind of data collection, you could use any sort of smartphone or mobile device. Or in fact, I've got, let me show you what I would usually use quite frequently. When you're doing interactions with people, for example, at London institutions where I'd be involved in collecting data, often it's very helpful to use a tablet. So let me just log into this. And essentially, it just is an extremely efficient tool to kind of communicate information efficiently. Also, you can actually let people fill in. Let me actually bring up one of the forms that I'd used quite a lot, if I can find it. For example, I mean there's a lot there, but essentially I'm not sure if you can see it. It's very hard to see, but ultimately these are done through a lot of the software that I used, and you can actually formulate surveys and questionnaires and put in stimuli and any sort of cue for that particular individual to engage in, for them to fill in answers and so on and so forth. So ultimately I would use a lot of those tools that also allow efficient data collection, real-time data storage as well, and it just makes it far more efficient and optimal to actually communicate with others, and that would be in-person venues or in any other situation. So I'll close this here, and so in other videos I've also put demonstrations of the other kinds of devices and also the hardware and software tools that I had used quite extensively, and I'll put a link in the description for more information on that. So in terms of research data collection, it's purely based on, well, it can be based on purely just web-based online data as well. So using open access databases is something that's done quite a lot, and it could even be digital data sets of really any type of information, any type of metadata. So I've mentioned a few already, but there's also qualitative text transcripts, images, to things like financial, econometric data, pretty much anything. A lot of this is actually crowdsourced, so where that is where each user has kind of owns a dividend of the data, and some is more privately shared. So that's that. And of course there's all the data processing and the artifact pre-processing, quantifications, analyses, meta-analyses that involves the inferential statistics as well. I've been quite involved in debugging a lot of the data processing pipelines and doing the fact-checking, proofreading, and all this are essentially a kind of bunch of iterative processes, and as a person you kind of learn along the way through trial and error almost. So that's that, and of course much of this involves a lot of advanced computational modeling as well. I'll be talking more about that later. Another thing I mentioned is looking at the teaching and dissemination of content. So I've been quite involved in producing workshops and presentations in the past, and like planning the delivery of that, and also doing systematic reviewing protocols when it comes to publishing procedures, for example, and I'll explain more about it later. And of course that requires quite a deep understanding of statistics in terms of not just in terms of mathematical formulations, but also the neuropsychological imperatives, if you wish. So understanding logical fallacies and biases in humans, and psychophysical operations at the level of cognition, and that's a very interesting topic in itself. So I've done a lot of work in several places in the UK and at many organisations, for example in the UK and in London especially, such as at King's College London, and many other institutions and companies. I've collaborated with many academics, scientists and clinicians and technologists and professionals and administrators, I've worked with many groups also internationally in terms of within space and time. I've worked with many groups, and I have many strong connections via my work networks, my kind of personal networks as well, my professional work, and so on. That is also something I'm going to put in the description to give you more information about. So one of my interests is in neuroscience related fields. One misconception I think that about neuroscience that it's very narrow, but actually it's very broad in scope because it's so cross-disciplinary. And so we're not looking just at one particular brain set of brain cells in isolation, but we're looking at a holistic integration of the entire nervous system and the entire body, and how that's and also the idea of embodied cognition. So it pertains to pretty much every experience that one can have, and in fact I would argue that everyone is a neuroscientist in one way or another. Most people just don't know that they are. Hopefully that will, by the end of this video, that will induce a kind of paradigm shift inside your own mind. You'll realize that, I am a neuroscientist in a way. So that's that. So one particular aspect that I've examined deeply within the field of cognition and neuroscience is learning and memory, and also how learning and memory relates to other processes. And I think it's incredible to kind of contemplate, to learn about this organ that allows you to learn in the first place. It's very meta in many ways. So for memory, there are two main phases, of course. There's firstly the encoding stage, which is learning, where you upload information via sensory inputs coming into your nervous system, and you store it. You essentially connect A to B, so there's some sort of pattern formation mechanism there, and it's essentially part of the mechanisms of synaptic plasticity in the brain, and this kind of axon dendrite potentiation. So it's consolidating that connection weight between two or more nodes. And also, secondly, there's the recall process, where you actually recall memories. So that's either doing pattern completion or answering questions, recognizing someone's face, and so on. So that's that. So memory could be declarative, semantic information, or it could be episodic thoughts or mental maps. You can have memory in terms of procedural, implicit skills, walking, talking, cycling, and so on. More complex movements that you can acquire via training. So if you do gymnastics or martial arts, or if you learn how to perform surgery by hand, or via, now what they have is you can do it, medical specialists can do it via a robot, via a remote computer interaction simulation. They can actually maneuver some sort of robotic arm somewhere else, which is pretty incredible. So these are highly technical skills that is part of the whole learning and memory paradigm. And then memory can also be conditioned emotional responses to stimuli, and these would be additional to these, if you wish, evolutionarily hardwired emotional responses. There are also additional conditioned responses that one can learn additional to that mainframe. So we know that there are many neural network substrates that orchestrate the indexing of those decentralized memory elements. We know, for example, in the bilateral hippocampus, in the medial temporal lobe, these are structures that are highly involved in those sorts of processes, and they work with other neocortical layers, or gyri, as they say. So, for example, prefrontal cortex, gray matter, and the association areas, for example, in the occipital temporal or occipital parietal regions. So there's a lot of research on this to to back that up, and a lot of evidence that's been accumulated over the last 100+ years of scientific work. And I'm not going to cover all these now, but I'll definitely post the references below as links in the description. So the other fundamental concept that people need to understand is that learning and memory is highly interdependent on emotional, motivational, physiological functions as well, and vice versa. All these things are integrated and interrelated. One main goal of applied neuroscience is that we should aim to create the set of underlying preconditions that will maximize optimal learning and performance and productivity, whether it be in human activities or any sort of logistical problem when it comes to humans. So for example, one key insight that was discovered was that often including interdisciplinary content in, for example, learning material or healthcare communication, when you include interdisciplinary content, that actually empowers individuals to interconnect ideas in their own mind, and it allows them to learn new complex topics by auto-associating those with simpler topics that they already enjoyed. And in that way, one can actually rewire their brain to kind of gain knowledge more optimally. Part of that also is that there are mnemonics, mind map diagrams and acronyms that people can use for their learning, note-taking while watching videos or lectures, and also using a lot of multi-sensory audio-video content, three-dimensional interactive content. Also, it's very intellectually immersive, and that helps with learning and reflection processes as well. That is both at the individual level and at the group level as well. There's also implementation of hybrid physical and virtual omni-channel systems, high bandwidth systems. Because of course we are a product of our environment, whether we like it or not. So, and usually people either seek out new environments, or they can change the environment in which they live. So that could be the setting or the people they interact with, that kind of physical workspace or resources or consumables. We can actually also redesign digital interfaces too. So all of this are interesting ideas in developmental neuroscience and kind of applied cognitive science that I've employed quite a lot in my work over the last few years. And from that, there are essentially two main processes that one should understand quite profoundly. So firstly, in terms of how we can learn, the first thing is that we learn through kind of gradual classical Pavlovian conditioning. So that's through learning through repetition and conditioning and training, essentially via some sort of positive feedback loop reinforcement learning protocol. This is how we form habits, essentially. Just like any other animal out there, it's a part of habit formation, and we have neural systems for that. In fact, these same neural systems also highly involved, kind of hyper-stimulated, if you wish, in things like addiction as well. Whether we look at food or drugs or physiological desires, or even things like the internet media. If we look at how ideas spread and can be almost addictive, it's very interesting to look at that, to look at the epidemiology of cultural transmission of ideas, or memes, or psychiatric contagions. I can talk to you more about that as well. So the first process here is this kind of basic conditioning process. The second one, when it comes to learning and memory, are metacognitive, top-down metacognition strategies. So that is understanding cognition about cognition, or learning about learning. Essentially, one can empower themselves to educate themselves in those. And for example, you can engage in things like introspective neurofeedback, where you introspect on your own state of mind, or you can see your own physiological metrics or psychology from a third person point of view. These become very helpful when trying to optimize all these tips and tactics you've already used, how to kind of take it further. So often with that, there are many cognitive misattributions of physiological processes. So it can be, for example, basically I'm referring to things like cognitive dissonance of physiological states. So it could be psychogenic physiologic stress responses that you have that you may misattribute to different things. So if someone is if someone is tired about something or happy about something, or looking also things like placebo effects. So that's a whole field of psychoneuroimmunology that's also very interesting. But humans often have these, just like I do, just like anyone else, have a lot of confabulations or kind of incongruous dissonance when it comes to those cognitive processes. That these processes may not be perfectly finely tuned. And of course, there's still very super useful and powerful heuristics to leverage to your advantage. And in fact, using those, as the ones I've just explained, you can get to a point where something like learning a new skill or learning to do something originally is much of a burden to do, but actually and requires a lot of energy and cognitive effort. But you can get to a point where it's so internalized into your nervous system that it becomes almost instinctual and automated, and you don't really have to think about it. And it's almost as if you need to spend effort to inhibit that response, right? It just becomes part of your hedonic states of being, and that's a very interesting phenomenon. And I'd like to talk to you more about that later as well. So we understand now the cerebral taxonomy or structures here that would be involved in those sorts of cognitive processes I've just explained. So on top of the cortex and the hippocampus, what I've already explained, there's also the basal ganglia. If we look at the ventral striatum or the dorsal striatum, So we have the back of the brain here and the frontal cortex here, and these internal structures here that are responsible for a lot of the things that I've just mentioned. If we look at the basal ganglia, the kind of diencephalon region as well, there's a lot of interesting tractography, imaging data on this that I'll be showing to you later. We have cerebellar modules that are, again, all of these association kind of subcortical systems are highly interlinked. And of course, they're all linked with all the major neurotransmitter systems as well. So you will have heard already about the things like the dopaminergic system with dopamine. So of course, other neurotransmitter systems that include with molecules like serotonin, glutamate and GABA, adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, acetylcholine and oxytocin, and so on. And these have all been studied quite highly in the last 100 years or so. And of course, drugs can be used to hijack these in bad ways. They can be used to treat those in good ways. There are also congenital genetic preconditions, right, that are involved in someone's neurotransmitter cerebral system makeup. And also, again, to emphasize this is that my main endeavor with applied cognitive neuroscience, I just want to emphasize very strongly that lifestyle choices that people make affect those neurotransmitter systems as well. And that's a quite powerful tool in your arsenal to deploy, on a daily basis in your daily lives, whether you're at work, if you're preparing for an event. And that, again, is something I'd like to emphasize more and more. So, of course, there are many methodologies and methodological equipment used to study all these systems, neural systems. We have pharmacology and histology and microscopy and spectroscopy, magnetic resonance, other sort of bioimaging, vascular imaging, electrophysiology, invasive, non-invasive, electroencephalography, things like, also in terms of psychometric studies, there would be human-computer interactive 360 audio, video stimuli, augmented virtual reality, tools for psychocognitive studies, I've had a chance to use, so I've got, this is just, I think in one of the, if you check on my website, I've put the links to an actual demonstration of those that essentially are quite helpful to, I've used those quite a lot, and they can often be used, and they are often used with a lot of brain measuring, brain scanning devices, portable EEG, and other sorts of electroencephalography tools that one can wear. And those can become very helpful when combined with, other physiological metrics that you can measure. Things like eye tracking is something that I've been very interested in. There's a lot of interesting research in that. Devices that you can wear as watch, not this one here, but that also do all sorts of measurements. And a lot of research these days is doing a lot of multimodal, integrative analyses to give a much more comprehensive picture of human activities in general. And that's something of great interest of mine. So I've had a chance to use those in labs in London, in different institutions and organizations, also my personal home-based setup. And I show details of these in other portfolios and videos. So that's that. And of course, computational modeling, I've had a chance to use a lot to kind of bridge the gap from basic biometric bioinformatics to integrating that with a lot of the topographic mapping data and the neuromorphometric data. And that is something of great interest and of great value to anyone who's interested in just exploring the human experience and how we can quantify the human experience in a way that's very meaningful and very insightful. So there are, of course, clinical applications to everything I've just mentioned. For example, via cognitive behavioral therapy, via mobile apps. That's being done quite a lot now. It would also be, that would be for neurological or psychiatric, neuropsychiatric pathologies, but also for anyone out there that doesn't necessarily have, a specific clinical diagnosis. So that could be on the whole spectrum of kind of developmental learning disorders or emotional mood disorders. Things like anywhere from the spectrum of dementia to kind of mild cognitive impairment to just general kind of cognitive deficits that are not necessarily they don't necessarily have a kind of neurological clinical diagnosis. So anywhere from neurodegeneration, atrophy, to just basic deficits in cognition. Of course, these clinical applications are for pretty much everyone, not someone with a disease, quote unquote, but it's for also general physical and mental health of all people. So these are interventions for everyone in any capacity that can be quite literally very life-changing to many people. The other thing is that there are many quantified graphical interrelationships that one can actually put on a graph as trendline curves. So here we can have data that looks like a normal distribution or some sort of non-linear correlation where it originally becomes linear and then it decreases, right? So it can also be what we call inverse U function. It goes by different names if you do medicine or psychology or economics or computer science, but it's the same kind of data pattern in terms of the goodness of fit here. Is that kind of distribution. There's also basic kind of linear lines where you increase one variable, the other increases linearly. So it's a kind of gradient dependent, just basic, fully positively correlated relationship. You can also have the opposite where it's a decrease. As you increase one variable, the other one decreases. There's also the inhibition or loss or leaky systems, and here you would have something like a pseudo-sigmoidal curve that could represent anything where you increase the quantity of one parameter and the amplitude, and then there's a cost of diminishing returns after a certain point. There's some sort of resistance where it levels off, and adding more of input of that particular variable does not necessarily affect the other variable increase by a lot. So it kind of plateaus, it converges towards that particular threshold or limit. Of course, there's also semi-exponential curves and relationships. There's these sorts of kind of logarithmic or combinatorial relationships where initially it's kind of threshold gated, but then once you reach a certain point, it just exponentially rises. That describes many systems in nature. And also the polynomial curves with multiple ups and downs, with the sawtooth oscillations around an equilibrium point, some sort of steady state, but there's also oscillations, kind of cyclical, sinusoidal oscillations, where you can also have some sort of drift over time or space, and you can add to that stochastic random effects so there's variability. It becomes very difficult to analyze. You can actually deconstruct those components from the noisy artifacts through modeling systems, or modeling techniques rather. I can give examples of these later. There's also, when we look at psychological comparator systems in the brain, you can actually subdivide those into different kinds of parcellations and decision trees that also are very interesting rather. And you can of course plot averages, look at the skews, you can superpose them with other kinds of curves, look at the minimization and maximization points, so you can establish variable effectiveness optimality of this particular variable and optimize an actual system by looking at those mathematical variables. So it's deeply interesting and of great interest. Okay. So one thing I want to go back to is this idea of bottom-up and top-down processes. There is the bottom-up sensory information, so visual information, auditory, hearing, olfactory, smell, gustatory, taste, and also touch, tactile data, or somatosensory data. Also proprioceptive cues is one thing. Also heat and pain, that would be part of the somatosensory system. And so that's that in terms of the kind of bottom-up raw sensory perceptual systems for the input. But we also have to navigate and sample the visual spatial world selectively via our eye gaze. So this is where the bottom-up predictive coding comes in, and there's a lot of research from that, from kind of oculomotor, ophthalmic cortical recordings, and then eye tracking as well, looking at mechanokinetics, motion detection, as well as cerebral activity, and also people's just general thought processes. So essentially, the way that the brain works is that you must have some sort of software program running on the hardware of the brain that can make the decisions on the most salient features to attend. And you can attend your environment or people you interact with, or anything, and the brain must be able to dissect those features that you attend into vector components, and doing all the multifactorial integration to kind of reconstruct a holistic image or environment that you can actually visualize without any sort of sensory input constraints. And that essentially is a process that is intrinsic to learning and memory. Okay, so I'd like to do a thought experiment with you right now. So if I ask you right now to visually imagine a strawberry, right, the fruit, a strawberry, It's a red strawberry. You can see it's red. It's got little green leafy things on top. Now think of the same strawberry that's red, but think of it as green. And then now in your mind you can see a green strawberry, and you can see it in 3 dimensions, and you can rotate it in your mind in 3 dimensions of space. And now I can ask you to imagine the taste of it, and you can kind of recall the kind of taste in a way. Now if I ask you to imagine for it to taste like an apple and not a strawberry, so you're biting into a green strawberry that tastes like an apple, right? It's a weird thing to say, but the point I'm trying to get to here is that you have a brain, intracranially you have a system, you can actually run these sorts of matrix simulations, and that the fundamentals of the brain are not just to recall the kind of learned information, but also to integrate and most importantly plan for the future, for future goals too. So for example, when you so it's not all about learning memory, but that same system, for example, when you rehearse for an event, if it's like a competitive sporting event or public speaking or an exam or something like that, or any interaction of any sort with someone or with something, you will often pre-play it in your mind as a kind of microcosm emulation of the real thing, and that is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and is of particular relevance to anyone out there. So that's that. So here's another thought experiment I'd like to run with you. And again, these thought experiments to me, people think of neuroscience and they think of lab-based, pipettes and tweezers, or maybe like technical, like brain imaging stuff. But also a lot of neuroscience studying and research involves thought experiments as well. So for example, another one would be, so obviously you think you have free will, that you have the free will to say and do whatever you want to say and do. So if I ask you right now to, for example, think of someone that you know, right? It could be someone famous or someone close to you, pretty much anyone. So as you think of someone and you run through different options in your mind, you obviously don't think of everyone that you know, but it's a few people that come up to your mind, and now you have a face of one person, and their face or their entire body, it comes to the forefront of your mind. So you have that one person you thought of, and you can see them, their face and so on. So, but you cannot really account for why you thought of that person. Thoughts, the thoughts that you have in your brain, they just emerge in your stream of consciousness. You're given general, external and internal cues. Given that you have very little control in that moment, because it's predicated on so many other factors. So that you certainly have a sense of agency, but it is, free will is an illusion, as they say. And when it comes to, the work that I've done, my interest in the whole endeavor in cognitive neuroscience and computational neurobiology is to essentially figure out what those computations or algorithms are that underline these processes at the level of the brain. And it's of great interest to me, and hopefully thought experiments are a very good method to investigate those in interesting ways. And you must have that neural circuitry that can also establish, so these neural structures that can establish structures in cognitive functions like imagery or linguistically, in terms of the actual syntax of sentences and things like that. So for example, when you sample, you have these kind of deep temporal models whereby when you sample the visual world, when you read a text, You read from from left to right, from top to bottom. You probably start with the biggest font text when you sample a slide, so that your brain selectively samples the world, and it's not just having the neural circuitry to imprint content, but you also have to have a set of generative models, generative frameworks to actually navigate the content, actually making sense of all of it, and to actually produce further symbolic models or generative models of what, for example, what someone else is thinking. Okay, so one example of these cognitive structures in the mind is in linguistics, when you translate lexicon between languages. So here, English and French, for example. So if I say something like j'ai dû aller à Paris et à Londres en voiture pour voir des médecins spécialistes. That would translate roughly to I had to go to Paris and London by car to see specialist doctors. Or if I say something like j'aime travailler dans les matières scientifiques, en particulier la neurobiologie cellulaire, computationnelle et cognitive. That roughly translates to I enjoy working in science subjects, especially cellular, computational and cognitive neurobiology. So here again, based on vocabulary and phonetic and syntax functions, these are actually laid onto pre-existing cognitive architectures, the actual structures of language processing. So again, these are very interesting cognitive phenomena that are very interesting to explore. One other paradigm that I've examined is the effect of context. Context matters, as they always say. So when it comes to context in the field of cognitive neuroscience, that would usually be something like if you have a visual cue presented to be learned, presented in the context or the contextual data. For example, it could be ambiguous background data or noisy data as context to that particular visual cue. You can also present present the cue to different individuals with people with varying moods, for example, emotional moods. That is, the mood in itself is a context where that affects, for example, learning and memory functions. You can have ambiguous writing from someone as the main cue, but you can have additional biographical information that will give meaning to that uncertain word or sentence. Also, you can have things like a closed-loop system within the context of a greater ecosystem, sphere, or kind of macro universe in which it exists. So that these are many of the concepts now in physical sciences and engineering, all the way to understanding economics, for example. So context means you must have additional relativistic, probabilistic scores or uncertainty scores at the level of cognition, right? So these are, some may call them confidence intervals or error margins that you must have for each measurement or each test or each question that you have to answer, so that when you perform inferential statistics on all the information that you collect, with these additional uncertainty scores provided by contextual influences, the statistics, despite becoming more complex, become considerably more insightful. And that is a very important point to make in any sort of mathematical analyses of any kind of information, is to always understand that the influence of contextual influences. So that's that. And also, of course, you have mental schemas or mental maps that interact with the environment, or with people, or with information itself. And in order to reduce uncertainty or anxiety about something or someone, you have to increase either contextual information or model evidence. That is done through increasing sample sizes, gathering more data points, gathering more evidence for something, so that essentially you can have a model of the world that can do a lot more of the kind of rational, logical thinking and differentiation, that can do the predictive coding, that is a much more aligned with objective reality from your subjective self. Another way to look at it is that can explain the whole range of neuropsychological profiles of people. So people's likes and dislikes, their thought processes, their beliefs, look at hundreds of variable characteristics of people, personality traits, these kind of heterogeneous social political beliefs, or even what the food that someone enjoys. For all this, you kind of have to understand the neural systems and the sets of generative procedural neural networks that can and how they work and how they can be conditioned to emulate different likes and dislikes, but also when it comes to kind of applied cognitive neuroscience to personal life or education, it's important to understand that these neural networks in the brain are very general purpose, and it's important to internalize procedures to be able to deal with a wide variety of situations or beliefs by actually exploring what they call the search space of experiences, right? Where there are many parameters in the fitness landscape, as they say, and that is the landscape of different experiences you can potentially experience, or different states of being you can potentially be in, and it. From a scientific point of view, it's very interesting to look at the attractor dynamics, as they say, of how your neural networks inside your brain can kind of deal with the kind of messy real world, the kind of sea of raw information or experiences, and you can escape those what they call positionalities or kind of local optima, or these bubbles, to more kind of global optima. Or better states of being. And again, there are many different possible combinations of these states, and the whole enterprise of computational and cognitive neurobiology is to be able to make sense of these kinds of processes. So I just want to bring it back to something like learning from the whole learning and memory thing. So this is why it's important to, for example, learn from experiences, good or bad. Whether or not you go through a bad experience or a good one, it's always a learning experience. And so these are additional data points you can integrate into your network, into your model of the world, that helps you deal with potentially the next situation. Also, it's important for you to actually gather and explore novelty. People often seek their confirmation bias, whether they go outside, whether they go online. It's important to explore new locations, new ideas, new websites, new resources, engage in debates of any type. Don't just seek a confirmational bias. It's important to get this. You can also get a dopamine spike from these surprising and unexpected outcomes that are much of the time unwanted. So that's not good. But also, a small minority of the time, they provide extremely helpful, very unique revelations. And these are things that you should probably think about when exploring these kinds of concepts. Also, moreover, we have cognitive systems or algorithms to create structure from unstructured data, and that is also an important concept to internalize. So ultimately, cognition is essentially an interface with and for action or behavioral actions. Of course, we have reflexes and visceral responses or involuntary actions. That those could be internal and external to the skin. But also we have volitional, voluntary mannerisms or actions, musculoskeletal actions, that are sent directly from frontal cortical regions and motor command neurons in the frontal cortex. And that would include pretty much the whole repertoire of voluntary actions, okay, and including obviously things like walking and moving and so on, but also body language, facial expressions, the actual vocalization of speech, all of this, kind of moving around in social interactions, and all of this is under the umbrella of understanding motor neuroscience and all the way to behavioral mimetics and cognition of action input-output sequences. And one key fact to bear in mind is that remember, we have 100 billion neurons interconnected by 100 trillion synapses. These are approximate numbers, but it's on that scale, on that order of magnitude. So the number of permutations and combinations of neural activity can never be easily predictable. And this, again, we go back to the whole free will thing here, because essentially the aim of theoretical neurobiology and biophysics and cognitive systems and psychology, looking at things like engineering analyses as well in the physical sciences, the aim is to essentially decipher how these algorithms work. So things like the kind of winner-take-all decision-making protocols, or things like reinforcement learning, how that works in the brain, the decision tree processes, understanding that in terms of neural structures. So essentially, my whole thing is to what academics and researchers and associates are doing is that we're trying to bridge a gap from the kind of basic input to the throughput to the output and back to the input, and that becomes much more complicated. It's a circular system, and we have to understand how not just these processes, but also how the systems work given limited resources being available. So whether it be limited information inputted to a cognitive neural system, things like limited money, limited resources, limited food, or limited energy, whether it be physical effort or cognitive effort. So again, this goes back to the kind of Bayesian contextual influences, modulating those input-output sequences, and it's something that is being researched quite a lot. So we also need to understand belief updates and social interactions as being an extension of sensory-motor integration, except it's much more complex, and there are so many more cofactors involved. So lots of examples of this. So if we look at, for example, psychosocial interactions in terms of how people assign cost effectiveness, how they assign value to intellectual capital. So that could be, that's a huge topic of interest within the whole idea of group theory in developmental psychology or developmental neuroscience and social interactions, all the way to understanding things like equilibrium states in economic game theory and game theoric model within the economic sphere. And again, we go all the way from looking at the anthropological roots to behavioral neuroeconomics, and essentially the whole the application of this in the real world is to, the goal is to, the question to ask is, how can we funnel human nature and things like self-interest in a kind of conduit of positive sum productivity. And once you kind of grasp that concept, it can be very enlightening concept at an individualistic level for you personally, but of course that kind of scales up to societal issues in organizational structures in organizations and actual companies and universities and so on. It informs legal systems, things like ethics, compliance, politics and public policy. Even leads to understanding how we can do better things like healthcare communication and healthcare dissemination. So how to market content more optimally, more efficiently in health communication. It's based on all this kind of data. It's very, very interesting. And of course there's the kind of back propagation from those societal systems. So there are philosophical, epistemological, historical, social-political, financial constraints that are put on the kind of science research or neuroscience research as well. So all of these things I've just mentioned affects the whole longitudinal life cycle, the kind of the developmental life cycle of research, work in academia, products and services, within education, within science, within the medical field, within pretty much anything. And those are the sorts of things within things like the tech industry. And so these are things I've been involved quite a lot at all stages of development. So eventually these ideas in cognitive neuroscience have an implementation in machines and vice versa as well. We look at recent developments in technological tools, things I have a lot of experience with, for example, basic things like e-learning platforms and databases, things like that. Also, there's a much deeper symbiotic integration in terms of computational cognitive neuroscience, all the way from understanding biologically plausible computational models to aspects of engineering dealing with deep machine learning training on data, like human data, looking at automation, looking at neuro-inspired AI, artificial intelligence, and the kind of the physical manifestation via cybernetic, humanoid robotics, which is all very interesting. And that, of course, has already there's been a lot of that over the last few years, and it's massively changed our understanding of the human body, the animal body, the body, the brain, the mind. Also, it has changed and will carry on changing dramatically the job landscape. So in terms of the types of careers that humans can actually do and get into. And that's something that is, in some ways mildly concerning, but it shouldn't be if we, I suppose, talk about it as early as we can and as much as possible. So I've been involved in very advanced work, and I'm very hardworking. I work hard every day and study and learn and work and interact with others, just like you and many other people. The key is that, again, we go back to the ideas of applied neuroscience to your own mind and your own lifestyle. One of the key thing is that you should have intrinsic reward for something, not just extrinsic material reward. And also reward in the process itself rather than the end goal. And I think it's important to love learning, and there's a process to learning to love learning. And one of the main thing is that you need to identify very clearly the pragmatic utility of learning in your own mind, but also because, of course, any knowledge may not be apparent how useful it is to you right now, but there is value to any knowledge because it could potentially help you solve problems in the future that you don't expect. So there's the potentiality of there's the apparent usefulness versus the actual long-term general purpose potential utility of knowledge, and that that is what you should concentrate more on, I think, especially in we look at applied neuroscience in educational settings, or clinical settings, or pretty much any setting. So that's very important. Yes, and of course, you always have and should always be very critical and self-critical of these methodologies that you employ to investigate the world around you, looking at the kind of built-in problem advantages and disadvantages of each methodology, of each technique, and actually have quantified metrics for those. This is the kind of scientific and data-driven mindset that I think anyone should have, and that you can use to your full advantage in pretty much everything that you do. So finally, just to say thanks for watching or listening, and in the video description I will add all the supplementary information and further details and the links, also the closed caption transcriptions for in terms of the voice transcript for the video, and also I'll put in corrections and updates, because there will probably be a few things I need to add on to in terms of corrections and updates. Do connect with me and like and share and subscribe and communicate with me. I'm always interested in hearing of opportunities or projects, or if there are any opportunities or projects that you may be interested in, and I may be able to connect you with those, because I know a few people. But remember, I may not always be in a position to reply to everyone all the time, so please bear that in mind. I'm kind of busy these days. Hopefully you've learned a lot, or at least you've learned at least one interesting or innovative idea that you can employ in your own life, either it be your personal life or your professional life, or in terms of the work that you do. And yeah, and that's that. And thank you so much for watching and for listening, and thank you.